Good evening, everybody. My name's Alan Vallance. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and welcome to our home here in the Northwest. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you all here this evening for this very special event which the RIBA is delivering in partnership with the Royal Fine Arts Commission. Being able to host both Lord Heseltine and Lord Palumbo in our facility here on the Liverpool waterfront is an absolute honour and a privilege. The presence of the RIBA on this site, amongst our other cultural and commercial partners and neighbours nearby, demonstrates the long-term power and the benefit of regeneration activities and initiatives. Two very significant such projects provide literally the backdrop for this evening's event. Liverpool 1, the only master plan ever to have been shortlisted for the RIBA's Sterling Prize, would not have been possible without Lord Heseltine, and one of his major legacies in this city, the Royal Albert Dock, or the Albert Dock as it was then. In the early 1980s, as a result of deindustrialisation, the loss of its maritime economy, Liverpool lost almost a fifth of its core population. This city, and cities like it across the UK, became places of extreme urban crisis. It was a difficult time. Growing up, despite the accent, over the water on the Wirral, my own memories of that time are quite dominated by one particular image, actually. As a 16-year-old in 1981, so feel free to do the maths, I remember being in a queue very early one morning outside the India buildings, just a few hundred metres away from here in Water Street, where the passport office was there at that stage. I was waiting for the office to open up so that I could get my first passport, a navy blue one, before going on a French exchange. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. The passport office was actually at the time on a go slow rather than a strike, fortunately for me. And from the corner of my eye, something appeared very suddenly. It was a convoy of Black Marias, as police transport vans were then known, if you're not familiar with that phrase, moving quickly, lights flashing. As they passed by, the back doors were open on most, but not all of the vans. I saw uniformed police officers sat in the back, heads bowed, clearly exhausted after a night out with the Toxteth riots. One or two with heavily bloodied faces, which was quite a shock for me as a young teenage man at the time. A powerful image which has really stayed with me throughout my life. Soon after that, I left the Northwest, just as the backdrop to tonight's event, the Albert Dock, was being redeveloped, but before it opened. I emigrated overseas for some 30 years, and I came back a few years ago to see the Liverpool we find today. It's a vibrant city with a regenerated waterfront and incredible transformation. It took an imaginative and a courageous individual with political heft to support Liverpool during that time. Lord Heseltine encouraged Liverpool to do what it's always done during more prosperous and confident periods. He looked outwards, drawing from international best practice. He advocated partnerships and sound master planning, and he took a long-term view of change. 30 years on, he continues to make a significant difference to this city, but also to many others, advocating the devolution of decision-making and finance and contributing to the establishment of metro mayors. To introduce Lord Heseltine, I'm going to shortly hand over to Lord Palumbo. A developer, former chair of the Arts Council of Great Britain, trustee of the Tate Gallery, Serpentine Gallery, chair of the Pritzker Prize for Architecture. The list quite literally goes on and on. A collector, commissioner, conservator of some of the most significant modern and contemporary architecture and buildings around the world, including designs by Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier, to name but a few. Lord Palumbo's lifetime of contribution to architecture, the arts and the built environment is without equal. Like Lord Heseltine, he's a future thinker who's challenged and encouraged architects to deliver exemplary and iconic schemes such as James Stirling's No. 1 Poultry in London. Though, as both of the Lords know full well, being at the forefront is not without its challenge nor controversy. If you ever get the chance to hear Lord Palumbo tell the story behind how No. 1 Poultry was delivered and what might have been with Mies van der Rohe's original scheme, I can tell you it's an unmissable event, but that's another time. In closing, I would like finally to take the opportunity to thank Lord Palumbo for the recent gift he's made to the RIBA of the entire collection of Mies van der Rohe's Mansion House Square project to the RIBA. On behalf of us all, Peter, Thank you very much indeed. But please now join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming Lord Palumbo to introduce Lord Heseltine. Thank you, Chief.
My Lord, ladies and gentlemen, as Chairman of the Royal Fine Art Commission Trust, I would like to add my voice to that of Alan Vallance in welcoming you to this second Lord St. John of Fawsley Commemoration lecture, which we're delighted to co-host today with RIBA North. We're enormously grateful to Alan and his team for acting as our partners and for making available this fine space in their splendid new building. It is a great pleasure to have with us not only high-level representatives of the RIBA, but also senior Liverpool architects, including the architect of this building and the co-founder of the Urban Splash, Jonathan Falkingham. Sorry about that. Very bad manners. For the younger people here, Norman St. John was an outstanding and idiosyncratic arts minister in the early 1980s, and in 1985 was appointed chairman of the Royal Fine Art Commission, which advised the government and other public bodies on design of new architecture and public spaces. It was closely involved, for example, in preserving the Lyceum, which at one point came close to demolition, and in helping to ensure that university buildings were fitted as sensitively as possible into Abercrombie Square. One of its longest-serving members, Giles Gilbert Scott, was of course responsible for a building that ranks among the very finest of the 20th century, Liverpool Anglican Cathedral. At the other end of the scale, he was also the winner of a competition in 1924, sponsored and promoted by the Royal Fine Art Commission, for the design of what became and still remains one of the most iconic pieces of industrial architecture throughout the British Isles, namely the red telephone box. Norman had the foresight to set up a charity, the Royal Fine Art Commission Trust, to sit alongside the Royal Commission. This charity focuses on education in the fields of art and architecture and on the encouragement of visual awareness. Now, 6 years after Norman's death, we're delighted to have this second lecture in his honour, following on from Lord Foster's inaugural lecture last year in Manchester. Norman took great pleasure in telling me, Norman St. John that is, more than once in fact, that he brought some of his commissioners to Liverpool in the 1980s to meet the City Council and see its challenges at first hand. As any civilized person would, he thought Liverpool a magnificent city. But it happened to be a day of major problems on the railways. And in order to get back to London, as they had to, as their diaries demanded, he commandeered the only vehicle big enough that he could find at short notice. And so Norman and some of the country's finest and most distinguished architects travelled all the way back to London in a hearse. They had come here, of course, to praise Liverpool, not to bury it. But there were plenty of people at that time who were reading the last rites. We know that some senior politicians thought the city was beyond saving and were talking in terms of managed decline. They were dark days, as many of you will remember only too well. That Liverpool not only survived but flourishes owes a great deal to our very distinguished speaker today, Michael Heseltine, who in this city, above almost anywhere else, needs no introduction. Suffice it to say that his commitment as Environment Secretary to driving a renaissance here through, for example, the Garden Festival, changed perceptions to such a degree that his influence can fairly be described as pivotal. Spreading that success is now one of the challenges of the Northern Powerhouse. When he was Energy Secretary in the middle 1970s, Tony Benn hung on his office wall a map of Britain. It was upside down. He wanted to shake up visitors' perceptions and make them think differently about economic relationships and the regional distribution of wealth in the United Kingdom. It may also help us to think differently if we reflect, for example, that the geographical centre of the British Isles is Glasgow, that London itself is northern in a global and European context, that the UK is not only roughly the same size as the state of Minnesota on the United States-Canadian border, but also further north. I'm reminded of the late Stephen Hawking's no boundary theory, which he compared to travelling to the North Pole. By the time you arrive, he said, the word north has lost its meaning. Whichever way you turn the map, Liverpool is not so much northern as at the heart of things, nationally and internationally. Its history of doing and making, of creative endeavour and world-changing innovation is second to none. It is, in the final analysis, a powerful city, well capable of asserting itself without waiting for permission from London. The rediscovery of that power and personality, of the ability to create and demand success, is a key part of the story of the last 40 years, and one on which I have the greatest possible pleasure in asking Lord Heseltine to speak. Thank you.
Well, Alan, Peter, thank you very much indeed for those very generous words of welcome. It's always a pleasure and an excitement for me to come back to this city. And I will try to tell you how it happened in my life. And for anyone who's looking for the master plan, for the carefully contrived scheme, the thoroughly detailed roadmap, switch off now. You will hear the story step by step, luck, quirk, choice, one after the other, tumbled through my life and ended up with me being here tonight. But before we start on that journey, this lecture pays tribute to a friend of mine, about whom I will say just only a very few words. He was a curiosity. He was an eccentric. He was someone who lit flames. You knew about Norman. I first knew about Norman when I went up to Oxford in 1951. I had cut my political teeth in the general election campaign of that October and had met a Conservative agent, Mr. Jane Rees, who said to me, "Oh, you're going to Oxford, you must see Norman." I had met him, he said, in Cambridge, where he had been an officer of the Cambridge Union. And so, very early in my days as an undergraduate, I knocked on the highly impressive doors of his rooms in Christchurch and was bidden to enter. And I was 18. I'd come from a British public school and been brought up in South Wales. And here was this apparatchik, this elegant figure, this sophisticated guy who knew it all, ruled the world, spoke a language which, frankly, I half understood. And it was, having talked to me for half an hour. He gave me advice. Be circumspect, he said. Be circumspect. And to this day, I don't know what the hell he meant. But that was the Norman that I first met. And we didn't have a lot in common, it has to be said. My life after that at Oxford went along the journey of commercial activity. I had a family and cut my teeth in the political grassroots. Norman was not a man for the grassroots. He would be a man who aimed to get in at the top and somehow would contrive to get in at the top. He lived in a cultural and artistic world in which he was the peer of the people at the top, not probably having much in common with those at the other end of the spectrum. He was a glitterati. He dressed like it, spoke like it, behaved like it. He was gay, and whether he ever outed, I do not know, but everyone else knew that he was gay, and he lived that world. I said our paths did not much cross until he became a cabinet minister in Margaret Thatcher's government of 1979. Two memories. One of his greatest achievement, which was the day he came to me. He said, Michael, my department doesn't really rank that much in the pecking order of government activities, but you seem to be able to get legislative vehicles more or less at the drop of the hat, and I've got a very good idea. I want to make politicians accountable in this country in a way they are elsewhere by creating select committees. And I haven't got a legislative vehicle. Would you be prepared to tack my proposals onto one of yours? So I said, fine. I've never claimed credit for that, although I would be proud to do so. It was Norman's idea. I merely helped it to its fulfillment. He didn't last long in the front line of politics, and I don't think that's altogether surprising. Of course, I have no inside knowledge as to why that should have come to such a short-term end. There was a lot of leaking going on about things from the cabinet, and no one quite knew who it was. Quite a lot of gossip, one or two unfortunate references to colleagues. No one quite knew who it was. Quite knew, but somehow. But I think the thing that really got him was the cabinet, as you know, is a long table in which the Prime Minister sits at the middle. And it's quite a long way down there. I was this end. But in most cabinet meetings, several times, there would be an enormous outburst of laughter at the far end. And Margaret didn't like that at all. She felt it was something that she'd said, and she was right. And what Norman had done was to paraphrase it in an extraordinarily witty way. And so Margaret couldn't easily ignore it. She would say, "What did you say, Norman?" And Norman would repeat what he'd said, changing one or two of the key words in a way that was totally brilliant, but of course produced another wave of laughter from all those who'd heard the original intervention. In the end, he had to go. Well, we became friends. He liked my wife very much, who shared many of his interests and who actually became involved with the Royal Fine Art Commission, of which Norman was the conspicuous chairman, I think we can say, without fear of intervention. I could be more descriptive about the conduct of the business of the commission, which was very much that of a don delivering a tutorial to the fellow commissioners. But then Anne was fascinated by it. He loved our house, he loved our garden, he came. And I was hugely flattered during my challenge for the leadership of the Conservative Party in 1990, when 2/3 of the way through the campaign, which was widely reported, Norman sent me a press release in which he announced his support for my candidature. So he was a memorable guy, someone who was a life enhancer. And I'm privileged to be invited to deliver the second public tribute in this important lecture. Now we go back to the journey to devolution. How did I become so preoccupied with something which, if I had studied my history more carefully, should have been obvious to me from the earliest of days? There were probably 10 great cities that made the empire. And the empire was the greatest empire the world has ever seen. So something must have been right about those 10 cities. Of course, London was one. But London didn't make the empire. You can name them. The Birmingham, the Newcastles, the Manchesters. Nobody can leave out Liverpool. And so the background, look around, walk the streets, it stares you in the face. This is a great imperial city for one of the world's most phenomenal empires. So I should have really understood that. I began, and I suppose looking back on my career, I was quite eloquent on the subject of the centralization of power. Why did I oppose nationalisation with such vehemence? Because it was the centralization of power. Why was I so worried about the privileges, the tax privileges given to the City of London to take over the family businesses outside London? Because that was another massive centralization of power. And perhaps it all began as a Swansea boy. Perhaps it all happens in Cardiff. Or perhaps it was London that was where the action was. But I never really put it together with the coherence that I try to do in this particular lecture. And of course, as a Swansea boy, I went to London, as so many of my peer group of graduates from the provinces did. The next real step, I suppose, is to the House of Commons in 1966. And within a very short period of time, I found myself working for one of the more far-sighted of Conservative cabinet ministers of recent times, Peter Walker. And he was, and I was his aide, he had to deal with a report that the Labour government of the late 60s had commissioned from Redcliffe Maud, looking at the pattern of local government in this country. And at that time, there were 1,400 different authorities. And Redcliffe Maud said, we really need 60 unitary authorities. Well, that's rather bigger than the 10 big cities that I named, but you can move along and you add the Leicesters and the Plymouths, and you quite easily get up to 60 economies, which makes sense. But of course, in the 18th and 19th century, when local government was emerging, you only had two ways of getting anywhere. You either walked or you rode. And so having 1,400 authorities meant you were in touch. By the time that we were looking at this issue in the 1960s, we had aircraft, we had trains, we had cars, we had motorbikes, we had myriad different ways. And of course, there was the telephone and the early days of television. So 60 became much more relevant and much more sensible. Now, the problem for Peter Walker was a simple one. It was broadly two tiers. There were the counties, and beneath the counties, perhaps 6 or 7 districts. The districts were broadly controlled by the Conservatives, and the Conservative councillors were broadly the officers of the local constituency parties. And however far-sighted and well-meaning and nationally orientated your attitudes may be, saying to councillors it is in the national interest that your job goes is, in the proverbial terms, a lead balloon. And so Peter had to make a decision what to do. Either he couldn't go with the Redcliffe Maud report, he had to find an alternative. And so he looked for a two-tier system which reduced the numbers very considerably, from 1,400 to about 400, but not to the 60 that Redcliffe Maud had proposed. But he had to do something, because the next Labour government otherwise would have implemented Redcliffe Maud. And so I remember, as his number two, feeling what we were doing was not intellectually all that clever, but it was the real politics of the day. It was all that we could reasonably do. By 1979, we've now moved on a decade after the winter of discontent, which such had devastating effects in this city. The move to the left of the Labour Party had created in my party two overarching dynamics. First, we had to cut public expenditure, which had got out of control and had brought the IMF into our affairs. And secondly, we had to deal with the very left-wing orientation that, for example, brought Ken Livingstone to Mayor of London. Leader, not Mayor, leader of London. And so I found myself in the unhappy position of actually getting rid of the sort of metro authorities that Peter had introduced with my assistance in the 1960s. And that meant that the Merseyside Authority and the GLC, I think it was, and the Manchester Authority, the two-tier, the top tier, Avon, very unpopular in Bristol, the Humber, very unpopular in that part of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, they all went. So I actually undid a great deal of what Peter had pioneered with. But 1979, in the aftermath of the winter of discontent, was a difficult time. The economy was in great difficulties. Unemployment was rising very fast. Inflation was nearly out of control. And I, by that time, had found that I really had three very clear views. First, I came from the private sector. I'd created what was by then quite a successful business. And so the enterprise culture was deeply ingrained in the way I thought and behaved and the attitudes that I had. Secondly, a lot of my early commercial activity had been in the property world, and I loved property. I loved the quality of old property. I was interested in renovation. I had built new estates. I was deeply into property. And as a result of being interested in property and construction and capital investment, I hated dereliction. And that was my background when I became Secretary of State in 1979. I had discovered the London Docklands, and that was 6,000 acres, a stone's throw from the most prosperous part of the United Kingdom, the City of London, where the docks had gone downstream, where the utilities, gas, electricity, had gone and left the scars. There'd been no private building since the war, and you were left with large numbers of council tenants whose children had gone. They were elderly. They were dependent in many ways for their income on one form of public sector support or another. And what they wanted was more public support. That was their life. That's what they understood. And here came this Secretary of State who had a very different view. A second thing that happened is that I took over from Peter Shaw, who was the Labour Secretary of State up until 1979. And he had introduced a scheme, a very commendable scheme, for the most deprived city in the country, in which he put one of his ministers into a sort of personal relationship. And they called it a partnership. And he said, the official said to me, your predecessor ran this scheme. Do you think do you want to do it? I said, yeah, it's fine by me. Your predecessor put himself in partnership with Liverpool. I said, fine, it's all right with me. So I became personally involved with Liverpool. As I said to you at the very beginning, there was no great strategy, no great plan. I inherited a position from Peter Shaw. I could see no reason why I shouldn't do it. Peter Walker had invented in the 70s, as Secretary of State for the Environment, a grant called a derelict land grant, which was designed to get rid of the coal tips and the ore extractions and the dereliction in the countryside of all the extractive industries. By the time I became Secretary of State here, it had done its job. Broadly, the green fields were back. And so I had this very substantial grant mechanism, and I said to my officials, very well, we will use it to clean up dereliction in the cities. And this gave me a significant fund. I'd also been suggested by a friend of mine in the House of Commons to the European experience of garden festivals, where what in Holland and Germany they had done after the war with the bombed sites was to realize that these had negative value. They were full of rubble, they were full of pollution, whatever it was, and nobody was going to build on them. So the state stepped in, cleared the negative value, in my commercial language, and planted trees and grass and made them attractive, whereupon, of course, the private sector was prepared to invest. I liked the idea, and I had the money to do it, and I was going to choose the first site. And as part of my responsibility as Secretary of State, I was responsible for large parts of the heritage. And I had the power to list buildings to stop developers knocking them down. Secretary of State, there's this dock in Liverpool. Hopeless. You know what to do with it. Been empty for years, rotten, falling apart. I'd better have a look. And I listed the Albert Dock. The dereliction in London, for 6,000 acres, I proposed what is the loosest of language, a new town corporation. Now, new town corporations, of course, were used to house people who were living in urban squalor in green fields. And I thought, well, why don't we, if we clean up the dereliction, why don't we have a new town corporation in the city? And then build and then keep. And of course, you remember I said about the children of the parents who'd gone. I wanted to keep the children there. Oh, Secretary of State, you can't do that. Why not? A lot of very specious reasons, but basically my department felt that they were the custodians of local government, and I was intruding by taking power away from local government. Shrugged my shoulders. But Secretary of State, if you do that, it will be hybrid legislation if you just do London. And it's very difficult to get hybrid legislation through the House of Commons. I said, fine. Where's the second worst place in the country? Liverpool. Give me general powers and I will designate London and Liverpool. This was 1979. So, the Garden Festival, the listing of the Albert Dock, the creation of 600 acres of dereliction into an urban development corporation, the concept of the derelict land grant being used in partnership with the private sector, a condition I imposed. 1979, Liverpool. In 1981, they rioted. Now, there's a very simple approach for politicians, particularly of the right. It's the yobs on the streets, they're no better than they ought to be, back the police. Now, I'm not against that view, because it is of fundamental importance that the police should be supported in similar circumstances. However, I said to Margaret, look, that would be sufficient, if you like, as a response. Tell Willie Whitelaw, the Home Secretary, to make the toughest noises. But I think it is more serious than that. And if you'll forgive me, I wish to leave the day-to-day running of my department to my ministerial colleagues, and I want to spend time in Liverpool walking the streets, having a look round, sussing the joint, just to sort of get a feel for what's going on out there. And she let me. And so I arrived. It was a huge success. Secretary of State, how very good of you to come. Noise is off. It took a riot. Secretary of State, what is your program? Oh, I'm going to talk to people. I'm going to listen. Very good. It's just what we want. Noise is background. It took a riot. Well, after 3 or 4 days, I'd been doing an awful lot of listening, and you get a sort of feel when the press are getting a bit edgy with the I'm listening story. The first of them, it'll probably have been the Liverpool Echo, said, well, you've been listening for 3 days, Secretary of State. What are you going to do? Well, what are you going to do rapidly replaced the what are you doing? And I realized that the game of listening was over. And I'd have to do something. And so I said to my colleagues, well, we better start preparing a list of what we're going to do. Now, you have to remember that those times, jobs were losing at a horrendous rate. I mean, every day there were more closures and the inflation was, I mean, it was a very difficult time. And there had been riots. Anyway, we spent 3 weeks here. And at the end of the 3 weeks, we gave a press conference in which we produced a list of what we thought could be done. But by then there was one characteristic, and this is formative in my whole approach. Because in the listening mode, and I listened all over the place. I mean, I went to Toxteth, I went to the trade unions, I went to all my opponents as well as all my allies, if I had any allies. And they all knew what was wrong. Absolutely clear, no problem at all. You, him, her, them. Everybody except me. And if you go back 200 years, the me's were the people who built this great city. And what everybody was doing was passing the buck. Blame someone else. It's the easy thing to do. What I couldn't find anywhere in those 3 weeks was anybody who said to me, this is what I will do if you'll give me the chance or the money or the opportunity. And that's why the list was so fundamental. Because what I was doing, wittingly, unwittingly, was drawing myself into a program of action in the city. And it's no prizes for answering the question, who was going to make it happen? Every night on a Thursday, I came up here with a loose-leaf book, rather like this, and each of the 30 schemes had a page. And I had a team of officials and of secondees from the private sector who'd spent the week working on the 30 schemes. And we would go through them over dinner. And by the end of the dinner, I knew where the blockages were. I knew what had to be done. And on the Friday, I spent the time unblocking. And the next Thursday, I came back and checked progress. And that was how it happened. But the thing that's fascinating to me looking back is how much of what we did formed the basis of policy which was to dominate the rest of my political career. There was a place called Cantrell Farm. Not many of you will know Cantrell Farm. It's in Knowsley. And it had an occupancy of 30%. Deck access, rat infested, polluted. And the Labour leader, Dick Knowles, came to see me and he said, Secretary of State, you're spending a lot of time in Liverpool, but we have this estate and we can't do anything about it. Will you help? I'll never forget the conversation. I said, yeah, look, but there's one condition. I am a conservative. I will look for solutions for you, but there may well be a private sector involvement, and you must assure me now, before I waste a lot of time, that if I come up with a public-private sector solution, you won't veto it as a Labour council on the grounds that it is doctrinally unacceptable to you. He said, we have tried everything, you have my word. Well, I sold Cantrell Farm to the Abbey National Building Society and Barclays Bank. Whether they've ever forgiven me, I don't know, but I did. And that was to lead on to two of the most exciting things I ever did, because I put a guy called Tom Barron in charge, and Cantrell Farm is now Stockbridge Village Trust, and it is full, and it is a community, and it's a wonderful privilege to go and see what has happened. But it laid the foundation later for me to design City Challenge, and at the same time to create the opportunity for tenants in council estates to become self-managers. We learned. Wavertree Industrial Park. It was, I think, Plessy and British Rail had this huge area of dereliction alongside their factories. And I went to them and I said, look, you know, we've got to do something here. We've got to find a way of creating jobs. Now, what I ask you is this. If I clear that land, will you outsource some of your activities, for example, catering, or, for example, the in-house printing machine that you're doing, whatever it is, and start small businesses? And they agreed. And so, first, that was good to see Wavertree Industrial Park, but it was the partnership of the public and private sectors coming together for the purpose of public policy, in other words, wealth creation, job creation. And what it also did was to create the concept of gearing. And this, again, has run through my life politically ever since. You see, if you spend £1 of public money clearing dereliction, you can slap yourself on the back and say, well, I've cleared the dereliction, that's good. But how much better if you say to the local authority, look, I've got the money to do it. Now you go out and find a local builder who, when I spend that £1 of public money, will build a house on it. Of course, it's much bigger than £1, but the fact of the matter is that you can use public money as an incentive to get the private sector to do what otherwise it wouldn't do. You can't expect the private sector to build houses for sale on derelict land, because no one will buy them. You've got to get rid of the pollution, chemical waste, whatever it may be. But if you clear it and you make it competitive, another word of philosophical significance, with the green fields of the suburbs, the private sector will build. And so the concept of gearing developed here in Liverpool and in London at that time. Even in the darkest days, the Urban Development Corporation, I took over 600 acres of the frontier, was delivering £1.50 of private money for every £1 that we put in. In London, much more buoyant economy, we were getting £10 of private money for every £1 that we put in. And it is now commonplace to get £4 or £5 of private money for every public pound that we use. And I have used these schemes time and again in different places. When the coalition government was formed, Nick Clegg asked me to become responsible for a regional development grant process to create jobs in those areas most affected by the cuts that were necessary in 2010. And we had a lot of money, we made it competitive, we made it open to bids, and the condition of the bids is you get public money if you are adding your money too, which has a wonderful discipline, because the private sector will only spend the money if they believe in the scheme that you're going to support. The scheme was ultimately taken up by George Osborne, where he persuaded the Housing Ministry, the Skills Ministry, and the Transport Ministry to put up a total of £2 billion a year, 12 billion over 6 years, into a single pot. Again, it was done by competition, and it had the most extraordinary effect. The City Challenge idea, which again was born here in Liverpool, was perhaps the most testing of these ideas, because we were going to use public money to renovate the most deprived estates in the country. These are not private sector estates, these are public sector estates. Many of them were in very bad condition. And we were going to make it competitive. Now, I knew before I announced it, and everyone here will know it, if you say about people in deprived circumstances and the local authorities that represent them, you are going to have to work with the private sector, and you are going to show what you're going to add to what I, as a central government minister, can produce. You're going to be called all sorts of rather nasty things. But we did it, and we invited 30 local authorities with deprived communities to bid, with only 10 winners. There was quite a lot of trouble, but the exciting thing was the second year, because those who lost immediately reacted in very abusive language, but they went off to see how the winners won. And I personally, my ministers and I, we judged the competition. I judged Birmingham, and Birmingham lost. And I'll tell you exactly why they lost. I liked Dick Knowles, who was the Labour leader of Birmingham, and he did the presentation on behalf of Birmingham. And he said, this is what we're going to do, this is how it'll work, this is the system, and I listened carefully. And after he'd finished the presentation, I said, well, Dick, you haven't mentioned what the head teachers think of this scheme. No, he said, no, but we'll tell them. That was the point at which I said, no, you won't, because you haven't embraced the head teachers. And if you know anything about the poverty of these areas, the people who carry a huge proportion of the frontline strain are the local teachers in the local schools. They know what the problems are, and every day they have to face it in their classrooms. And so not talking to them about what we were going to do to renovate this estate shows an attitude of what? We'll tell you, as opposed to we'll listen to you. So there were these schemes. There were Groundwork was born in St. Helens and is a question of volunteers around the periphery of towns and villages cleaning up the fringe areas. Came from St. Helens. Clean the Mersey. 25 years of cleaning the Mersey, and the fish are back, and the salmon are back, and the seals are back. Now, I personally don't believe that the job is done. I constantly referred to this as job unfinished, and I'll tell you why. And it's a classic example of the philosophical implementation in which I believe. I think that in the lifetime of some of this audience, cleaning water in urban areas will become a world challenge. Democratic communities are not going to put up with open sewers, which is what we had here in Liverpool, in their backyard. And so what I have said is, look, you did a marvellous job over 25 years. Now look ahead another 25 years and say, in 25 years' time, 50 years on, there will be no discharges into the Mersey, only clean water. And there'll be some people who say, oh, it's preposterous, intervening, and all that. I say, calm down. Any discharge that you're now making through any capital equipment that you're using will be out of date in 25 years. You are going to have to renovate and replace. All I'm doing is to tell you the standards by which you must do it. If you just do that, in another 25 years, you will have clean water going through the Mersey. And this idea was born one night after one of those Thursday meetings. I was in the Atlantic Tower Hotel, tired, glass of wine, looking out at this open sewer. And I said, what have we done to you? You made this city, and we have turned you into an open sewer. It's unforgivable, and we must do something about it. And I announced it I didn't consult anyone. I didn't talk to any great industrial figures or to any politicians. I simply said, we're going to do it. And it worked. But the initiative came to an end after 25 years. And I think that was a pity. Well, that explains the sort of the experience of being a clerk of works in Liverpool for 18 months. But of course, I then saw the world of which I was involved in the politics of, not looking down, but looking up. And go back to the creation of this great city, I was looking at it as they would have looked at it, not as ministers look at it or civil servants look at it. And it became increasingly clear to me that Whitehall is a series of functional monopolies. Now, I don't like monopolies. They always, in the end, fail to deliver because they don't allow choice, and the customer is subject to the producer. But you think about them. Transport, housing, defense, health, social services. You can go on. So if you climb the ladder as a career politician, or if you are a permanent secretary or an official coming up, and you are in the housing ministry, that's your job. That's your career. You will be judged by your success in the housing field. But if you're down here, you actually want transport to get from the housing to the city centre. You want a job somewhere around the place. You want a decent school. And so it goes on. In other words, you look at it as part of a community. They look at it and impose it as a functional extension of their departmental power. And that is totally inconsistent with the Liverpool that was created 200 to 300 years ago. They never said, ask London, or wait until we're told. They did it. Now, of course, there were limits to what they could do, limits to their ambition, limits to their understanding about perhaps how hard life was for many people. But, and I don't myself believe you can have a system where you simply say, get on with it, because the inequalities of wealth across the country would not make that possible. But to have a system where you simply impose the rules and tell people how they will behave has one damning consequence. It leaves out, ignores, fails to harness the inventive genius of the human being. That's the problem. And that's why I became fixated with the problem of local government and the domination of London. It was a huge privilege when David Cameron rang me and asked if I would produce a report. And I did that for his manifesto in 2010. And I advocated the introduction of mayoral authorities. Well, I won't go through the checkered history. We didn't do very well in trying to get them. But we did succeed in this city under Joe Anderson in creating a city deal which led to a mayoral authority. We managed to win one in Bristol. From that moment on, the government realized that trying to do the deals without incentives wouldn't work, because the councillors were frightened they would lose their powers. So we did deals. And that has led to a significant number of mayoral authorities. Here we have two, and this, of course, I think in truth we never anticipated that we would end up with a two-tier mayoral authority, but anyway, that explains the way it happened piece by piece. Manchester had done a very impressive job of showing how it could be done. Birmingham now, Bristol, Cambridge, Peterborough, Tees Valley. There are these mayoral authorities, and I believe that that is an important step forward towards devolving power and choice. And they do have real discretions. But it's not about the power of just are they allowed to do something? If I'm talking to one of these mayoral authority mayors, I say, you know, just do it. Do it. Let them try and stop you. Now, they can't break the law, but there is a whole range of things they can do simply by picking up the telephone. It's the influence of this person who has an overview of the local economy that is so important. And in my experience, there's fund of goodwill out there. If someone gets a phone call from a mayor and he says, look, I'm a mayor of X-shire. I've got a bit of a problem with some of the schools are not doing too well. I wonder if you'd like to come and have a chat. There's no industrialist. There's no vice-chancellor. There's no social worker who's going to say, oh, no, it's not my job. I'm working for the ministry of this, that, and the other. They say, of course we'll come. And out of that fusion of local interest, local dynamism, local self-enterprise in the public and the private sector, there is a huge opportunity for a man or woman who sees the whole scheme, whole scene, the whole opportunity, and has a vision for it. So that is where it all came from. That is what has driven my ambition to see the restoration of power to the conurbations, to the people, to the fount of initiative that made this extraordinary country what it is. Thank you very much.
Well, we've just witnessed a master at work. And in my lifetime, of course I'm not a politician, in my view, the greatest Prime Minister we never had. When Margaret Thatcher offered me the Arts Council, said, would you like to take this job on? I said, I'd be delighted and honoured to do it. Oh, but you must reflect on a decision like that. I said, I don't want to reflect on it, Prime Minister, if it's a job I'd love to do. Oh, I do like people who are decisive. And she said to me something else which Michael said when he was talking about Lord St. John, Fawsley, who said to him, be circumspect, be circumspect. Margaret put it to me in a slightly different way. She said, you are not a politician, and I am, but I'm going to give you the first lesson in politics. She said, never go into any room without knowing where the emergency exit is. I think it's rather similar.
I think it's the only sensible thing she ever said.
Well, she was very fond of you. And Dick Knowles was wonderful. I mean, he was, we spent hours. I mean, he was, Michael's absolutely right. You could do deals with him. I used to go to Birmingham. He came to London. I thought he was an old-fashioned Tory. But he was a marvellous man. And if he said something, it was never put in writing, he said, I'll do it. And he did it. And we had a marvellous time. Now, I'm sure there are some of you who would like to ask questions. We'll have quite a short Q&A, 10, 15 minutes. Who would like to start the questions to Lord Heseltine?
Just say the first word, or maybe two, that comes to mind to describe Liverpool.
Well, I think you will have got the feeling. I mean, Liverpool is one of the great cities of the world. And it fell on hard times. I have some pretty good views as to why that happened. You had some very bad managers. You had some, as a result, some pretty difficult trade unions. And there was just an acceptance that decline could go on without the government doing something about it. And I think the government could have done a lot more, a lot earlier. And I'm not going to make a party point in the sense that I'm going to say it was all the fault of the Labour Party, because I don't think it was all the fault of the Labour Party, but it was certainly their fault as much as anybody else's. There was just not... Well, I began to cut my lectures short because I didn't talk about other countries' experiences. And we're the only one that has this extraordinary centralized functional monopoly. And one of my experiences of traveling the world is to see how other countries cope with this. And it's so much more effective, the way these mayors behave elsewhere, and the incentives they're given. But the incentive, you heard what I said, you know, they don't have to do it, and if they don't do it, someone else will get the money. My golly, that makes them work. But the best one is Hokkaido. Now, not many people here will have heard of Hokkaido, but it's the northern tip of Japan, Northern Ireland in Japan. And in November to March, it's under permafrost. It's about as inhospitable a climate as you could choose. And I'll never forget this mayor of Hokkaido. And he was like a jack-in-the-box, leaping around, saying, it's going to be the greatest city in the 21st century. It's going to do this and that and that and this. And he had about 50 schemes. Probably half of them were mad. The other quarter, impractical. And out of the other quarter, perhaps a half would come to fruition. But I knew that every time he lost one of those 50 schemes, he'd find another one. And that's the dynamism that you've got to have. And in the private sector, I mean, I know this backwards because I've lived with this. If we were selling a project, in our case, advertising space in magazines often, we'd have boards. And the whole sales team was galvanized to getting their prospects in one color on the board, their hot prospects in another color on the board, and their wins. And they'd be up there for everyone to see. And I, as the guy who in the end knew that my fortunes depended on the prospects and the hot prospects moving across, I would go and watch this all the time. And I knew, and I couldn't blame them, that of those prospects, probably 2/3 were rubbish. They just had a nice phone call from them. They said, well, good, that's a prospect. Wasn't a prospect at all. But you had to have a salesman who would never let you see a shorter list of prospects. You'd go and find another one. And it's that attitude, which, of course, is essentially a private sector attitude. Now, the private sector can't run cities. It's not their job, it's not their motivation. But you do need that dynamism. And that's that, if I could, to Liverpool as a representative of great cities, partnership. Get people working together. That, I did a report called "It Took a Riot" for Margaret. Well, I don't think she wanted it, but she got it because that's what everybody said when I came here. David Cameron asked me to do it again in 2006, I think, and I came with Tebbit Leahy and we did an updated report. It was child's play. We simply sat in a room and they all came flooding through and said, this is what we're going to do, this is what needs to happen, we need a bit of help from the government here, we'll do that, it'll be here. We put it all in a report, and my only criticism is why hadn't anyone else put it in the report? They all knew what was going to happen or what they wanted to do, but no one had actually put it in a report. So that's what Terry and I did, except for my obsession with cleaning the Mersey. That was about all we did, was just put it in a report. But you won't get that from Whitehall, you see.
This lady in the second row.
Liverpool seems to be clinging on just about to maintain its World Heritage status through UNESCO. How big a risk do you think to the future of the city is losing that status, or is that just a side issue for the future of the city?
I don't know enough about it. I do know about the issue. It's about the docks, isn't it? And I suspect that I don't know which side I'm on. I suspect I'm on the side of developing the docks, but I'm not well enough informed to be sure. Frankly, I would go and look. And I'm arrogant enough to say having looked, I'll tell you.
It's only just there, so.
The what?
It's only just there.
I know, I've been there before, but I haven't been with this in mind. I know that, in the end, wealth is pretty eloquent. But I would need to be sure before I said which way I'd go.
Just wondering what you think of the involvement of Carillion in Liverpool and what might have gone wrong.
And I know about Carillion, and it collapsed and all of that, and I don't like that. But do I believe in contractualization? Yes, I do. So monitoring it and making sure that it's properly done is my answer. But I don't, again, I'm afraid I don't know the details of what Carillion is or has done in Liverpool.
I thought it was very inspirational what you said, and a fantastic understanding of what's required, that if you make local decisions and succeed or fail in your own merit, you make better decisions. But I don't see this throughout Whitehall. And I still think that when you talk about gearing, most of the gearing is aimed towards London at the moment, i.e., we're still trying to create more wealth and jobs down there. HS2 is basically going to be a commuter train to get more people to move into London for jobs, because you haven't got the housing there. If we improve the infrastructure around the regions and use the country as a whole, because you don't need to be in one place to make decisions and work these days, we'd have a country which could afford housing affordable for everybody and spread the wealth around the regions. But we've still got this London-centric spending, which basically, it feeds on itself. You need Crossrail, and you're now talking about another road under the Thames. We should be spreading this creation of wealth around the country. We've got the capacity to do it, but we're overheated in London still. Do you see this changing in the future?
Don't kill the golden goose. London lays a lot of golden eggs, and it's a complete fallacy to think that impoverishing London enriches the provinces. So there's a balance. And I happen to be a fan of George Osborne. I sat on his National Infrastructure Commission until I was sacked. And there's no doubt there's now a much bigger and better awareness of the need to improve the provincial infrastructure. HS2 was a classic example, you see. I mean, it wasn't, there are Tories who want to cancel it, but it was Ed Balls, I think, who was leading the Labour Party to cancel it. So, I mean, of course, he would defend it by saying he was going to spend more in the north, and that, I think, is the Tory critic as well, spend more in the north. But you've got to get to the north, and anyway, I happen to believe that HS2 is the right decision in view of the undercapacity on the western routes. But look, there's more to be done. We tend to be an over-consuming, under-investing society. I have lots of things that I would do myself. But you look at the Pennines. West of the Pennines, we've got Greater Manchester, Greater Liverpool, doing the right thing in the right way. You look at the east of the Pennines. It's pretty depressing,
I just want to say very much a thank you to both of you. I did hear Peter speak in the Anglican Cathedral many years ago to an audience of 800, and it was kind of an architectural talk. It was wonderful. I like the notion of walking around a city to understand it, and I can appreciate what you said about coming to Liverpool and walking. I walk everywhere in this city. I don't drive. I walk everywhere for certain reasons. There is a report that's been produced recently about the quality of fumes from traffic, and Liverpool was named as one particular city. And it's to do with public transport, it's to do with the motor car. There are whole issues that I think the private sector might be able to address to do with transportation. And I just wonder, are there any observations about how we could improve transportation in this city?
Well, it's not private sector. They can't do it themselves. It has to be central government regulation. And I see the government is talking, as the world needs to be talking, about environmental constraints to deal with CO2 emissions. It's going to happen, the question of how quickly, but it will be government regulation, not the private sector that does it.
What should the structure of local government in this country look like in 20 years' time?
60 unitary authorities, direct elected mayor. But I'll tell you a very interesting story to me. Was in 1990, when I became Secretary of State again, I couldn't persuade the Tory party to go for single-tier authorities, unitary authorities. But I did manage to persuade them to give the local option, so that if the local authorities in the area wanted to go unitary, they could. And about a dozen, 15 did. Some big Tory areas did, Wiltshire and I think Staffordshire, others. But in Scotland and Wales, there weren't any Tory councillors. And so I got rid of all the second-tier authorities by legislation. And I then went, when I wrote the report, No Stone Unturned, it was all about England. I thought, well, come on, Heseltine, you can't just not talk to the Scots, the Welsh and the Irish. You must show some gesture. So I set off for Scotland, thinking I would get roasted for getting rid of the 2 tiers in Scotland, which I would have done in England if I'd done it, which I didn't because I couldn't. And anyway, we had this meeting of the Council of Scottish Local Authorities, and it was going rather well. They were being rather polite to me, and I began to wonder what was going on. And so after about 20 minutes of pleasantries, I said, there's one subject hasn't come up, and that's the districts. And they all looked around. And I said, yes, no, you remember the districts, the 2 tiers of districts, I got rid of them in 1992. Silence. And then I looked at the audience, and they were perhaps 35, 40-year-old councillors. And I got rid of the districts when they were at school. And no one wanted to bring them back. And I tell you, I mean, you've got all this stuff about cuts in local government. And we've got 2 tiers. We've got, 6 chief executives and all the apparatus and all the buildings and all of that. It wouldn't solve the problem, but it would certainly save you an awful lot of money.
Michael, I think we all want to thank you very, very much. I've got a very short personal story. I really never knew Michael Heseltine very well, and it was not from want of not wanting to know him, but he was Secretary of State for the Environment, and a development with which I was concerned in the City of London would have been decided by him, and I thought on balance it was better not to know him, because that can be an awkward thing if he makes a decision in your favour. But he has, I think he has this wonderful way of walking and understanding through walking the rhythm and the beat and the pulse of his journey, his particular journey. And I think that's he must be one of the very, very few politicians who actually take the trouble to do that. And through his, through these walks, his understanding of the community, I think, is unparalleled. So, Michael, thank you very much indeed. We do know one another a little bit better now, and better late than never.